Lesson number 9 has to do with one of the most difficult problems that we have dealt with in the United States in recent years. That's the federal government's power over interstate commerce. Now, the design of the Founding Fathers was to give the Congress the authority to keep the free flow of goods from state to state, so that from shore to shore, it didn't matter where it was produced, it could be sold anywhere in the United States without anybody being able to interfere with its transportation from state to state. And so that brings us to this Interstate Commerce Clause that has created so much discussion and some dissension in recent years because of the federal government's tendency to use this as an excuse to come in all kinds of areas the founders never intended. So number 1, our first blank, is flow. The Founding Fathers didn't want California, that originally had an exclusive monopoly on oranges, that is, to exploit that fact and make anybody getting oranges pay a 10% tax to California or something. They didn't want that to happen. They didn't want industrial goods of the East and shoes or something else that may be a monopoly in a particular region. Didn't want the states to be able to exploit that fact before anybody else in the country could get it. They want a free flow. Now, it had reference primarily to the transportation of these goods all the way across the country. So that's number 2. The regulation of interstate commerce was referring primarily to the free, easy transportation of all goods coast to coast. Now, under the pressure of war and depression, the federal government was induced to use this for different purposes than it was originally designed by the Founding Fathers. War and depression are heartbreak experiences for any country and any people, and very often we pass bad laws, or the courts will extend and stretch the interpretation of existing laws in an effort to solve problems that are on us. And as a result, we have the federal government using the Interstate Commerce Clause as an excuse to say that they can control anything that affects interstate commerce indirectly, and that's your last blank. Now, everything in our whole commercial life practically affects interstate commerce indirectly, all the way from the growing of the food, the intrastate transportation, and that brings you to your next blank. This type of interpretation by the Supreme Court to say that anything that affects interstate transportation or commerce indirectly is under the jurisdiction of the federal government has been interpreted to give them authority over things intrastate. Now, that's inside the state. I'll tell you, the Founding Fathers never intended that. Intra, I-N-T-R-A, state, intrastate, transportation of goods. And labor disputes. The Supreme Court has always turned down federal jurisdiction over labor disputes until about 1936. And then they began to say this might affect interstate commerce. So got to get in there. So in they came. And one of the reasons that the Chrysler Company went down was because its union had the backing of the federal government, and it pushed wages up higher and higher and higher till Chrysler found itself scarcely competitive anymore. Now, in some other companies, they say to the employees, keep your wages down so that we can keep our product selling. We'll make a lot of profit and we'll share the profits with you. But keep the basic wage structure down. Well, union bosses don't like that because they make their, points by pushing wages up, whether the industry can stand it or not. And so between regulations of the Chrysler Motor Company and the support of a built-in structure of compulsive labor, acceptance of labor pressures, the company reached the point where it was going bankrupt. Now the government says we'll take some people's tax money and feed it into the Chrysler Corporation and save it. Now this is what Mussolini had in his corporate state under fascism, where the government takes over one corporation at a time. And you have 5 cabinet members now supervising the work of the Chrysler Corporation, with tax money coming in at a low rate of interest to support it. The next thing you're going to hear is that General Motors will be in deep trouble. In fact, Ford may be in trouble next, and then they'll say, well, we'll do the same for you, the same for you, and you'll end up with your automobile industry nationalized. Now, these are things we need to understand about our economy. You got labor disputes under B, all right? C is federal controls over anything which affects interstate commerce directly or indirectly, which means that it comes down into almost every aspect of our economy. Federal. And D is also federal. Federal control over any industry which is involved directly or indirectly in the nationwide current of commerce. Well, you try to think of something that isn't. And as a result, our whole economy now is shot through with federal regulations and federal intervention and federal controls until business is being stifled. That plus the regulatory agencies that have come in under the basis of general welfare, etc., has made it very difficult for American business to remain competitive with some of the rest of the world, particularly where they have slave labor or very cheap forced labor, such as the communist countries. All right, now number 5. The only way to correct this obvious abuse is by an amendment to the Constitution to force the interpretation back where it belonged. And so if we did, we would say something like this: the regulation of interstate commerce shall be restricted to transportation and shall not apply to any phase of production and sales or any activity which merely affects interstate commerce indirectly. All right, we're all together there? Transportation and production are your 2 blanks. All right, now what about the regulation of commerce with the American Indians? You see, it's important to understand that our Indian population originally, if it belonged to tribes, considered themselves a nation within a nation. And the federal government said it had a responsibility toward our Indian brothers and sisters. And so they said, since some people are exploiting them and selling quack medicines to them, and especially alcohol, the federal government will have control over that commerce in order to protect them. So that's what that's all about, particularly alcohol. All right, Roman numeral 4 provides that Congress shall have the power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization and uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcies. Well, originally, you see, we wanted as many people to migrate to the United States as would. You see this building on the screen? That's the main center in Ellis Island, where hundreds of thousands and I suppose millions of people had to come through and were processed as they came to this beautiful land of liberty. Land of liberty. The tired and the poor, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. This is where they came. That's on Ellis Island. All right, now gradually the states, which had been actually doing all the regulating of immigration up to, well, in the beginning, that was conceded to the federal government so that we'd have all the states using the same rules. And you know, we had problems with England. England wouldn't allow any of its native-born people to become American citizens. And a lot of them were poor and wanted to come over here. You've seen these pictures like this one on the screen. I mean, America was the hope of the world for these people. But England would not allow a native-born Englishman to take out citizenship with us. And so that's your blank, citizenship. And she didn't do it until 1870. 1870, you know, the English Navy used to pull up beside our ships. They would come on board our ships, and they would look around for anybody that still had an accent, you know, and pull them off and put them into the British Navy. And they were doing that, as late as 1856. And it wasn't until 1870 that they admitted that maybe an Englishman would be foolish enough to become a citizen of another country. All right, now bankruptcy. There are 2 kinds of bankruptcy, and that's been a very difficult thing to handle. Ever since King Henry VIII, in order to take care of bankruptcy more readily, they've given that jurisdiction to the federal government. The first kind is involuntary bankruptcy. That's where a fellow borrows money from a lot of people, goes into a project, realizes he's going broke, And so he starts giving his brother-in-law all the proceeds, you see, or a few of his creditors, and the other creditors want to go into court and say, let's take everything he's got and divide it up evenly. That's called involuntary bankruptcy. Now that one wasn't so difficult to administer. The one that got us into trouble was the one that grew out of the Poor Laws reform in England and was adopted over here in due time, and that's voluntary bankruptcy. And that's where a person goes in and says, yeah, I'm not going to make it, I guess. I'm just not going to make it. I'd just like to have the government courts take over all my property and distribute it to my creditors, and let's call it quits and I'll start over again. Well, that sounded like justice. Some people get in that deep, and so they put in this thing, and in the United States we had voluntary bankruptcy each year. But you cannot eliminate fraud under this system, and as a result, we have a rule now that you can't take out voluntary bankruptcy any oftener than 6 years. That's the rule, because there's some problems there. Some people were just taking out bankruptcy continually, and it's a bit of a problem. And we still haven't solved it completely. Your bankruptcy judges and federal judges will tell you so. All right, now let's go to Clause 5. Congress shall have the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. Fix the standard of weights and measures. So let's talk about this for a minute. The power to coin money meant that we were on the gold and silver standard, and the government would have the authority to do all of this coining of money and determine the value thereof. We actually put our American dollar against the Spanish dollar, and it consisted of 8 parts, and so we call a quarter 2 bits, and 50 cents 4 bits. That's all out of the Spanish dollar, with the same weight in gold or silver as the Spanish dollar required. Now eventually we allowed, have you got number 1, gold or silver? Excuse me, A is gold and silver. And then under number 1, we eventually had the courts allowing the federal government to print paper money, providing it was backed by gold and silver. Gold or silver. It was backed by gold or silver. They said, all right, we can circulate paper money. Founders were worried about that, though, because once you start printing paper money, it's hard to keep it under control. Well, fixing the value of money changed in 1913 when the Federal Reserve Act was passed, which turned over to a consortium of private banks the control of our credit and money system. And this was in order to facilitate the control of the amount of money that was circulating, so it would prevent depressions, they thought. But once it got into the hands of a private consortium of banks, its record is not good. And Milton Friedman pointed out that it looks like now they've been causing depressions, they've been building it up and deflating to their advantage and to the great disadvantage of the United States. He really took after the Federal Reserve in his recent television talks, and he said they have satisfied self-interest much of the time to the great disadvantage of the American people. And so look what has happened. Number 2 then is federal revenue system. And number 3, in 1933, the Federal Reserve was given the authority to take over all of the gold of the American people. And it was turned in, had to be turned in by a certain date. About $300 billion in gold was turned in. Now, they gave us money back in its place. They were silver certificates, so we didn't worry about it so much because at least it was backed by silver. But the gold is out now as of 1933 for all Americans. If you're a foreigner, you can still cash your dollars in for gold, but not Americans. Domestic gold standard was destroyed in 1933. All right? In 1964, the government went off the silver standard, and legal tender became merely Federal Reserve notes. And if you'll notice a dollar bill now, it says up here that it's legal tender and it isn't redeemable in anything. All right, now in 1971, that's when the dollar collapsed because the government announced that it could no longer redeem all of our euro dollars, all those dollars abroad. Even foreigners couldn't get gold for our dollars. And immediately the American dollar collapsed, as all of you know. And it's been going down ever since. All right, now the power of the national government to fix the standards of weights and measures is the next thing that's included in that provision, and let's just say a word about that. Actually, before leaving the subject of money, I probably ought to say to you that the whole problem of money, its origin, the way to make it stable, keep it stable, is something all Americans need to know more about. There's a way to solve that problem. You see, it is not fair to Americans to say, save your money, when there is a government policy that is constantly reducing its buying power. And that's what foreigners said. If your money is going to, you're not going to redeem it in gold, who knows what your money's worth anymore? Once you go off of precious metal standards, nobody knows what anybody's money's worth. And so it just floats around. Have you noticed that? Just going up and down, floating around. All right. Now, let's go over now to the fixing the standards of weights. Even in the Magna Carta, they were concerned about the fact that there just wasn't any good standard of weights and measurements. And so this was designed to give the federal government the opportunity to establish uniformity and prevent fraud. And those are your blanks. Let's have uniformity in our measuring system and in our weights. And the federal government therefore gave to all of our colleges, our state colleges, agricultural colleges, a set of weights and measurements that was to be the standard throughout the whole United States. Now you should know that our system is the English system. And ever since 1866, we've been authorized to adopt the metric system. But it just hasn't worked out except in some of the sciences and in medicine. But you start moving from the oldest measuring system in the world, which is the English system, over to the metric system, which is actually an artificial system. And it just hasn't worked out practically. And so the latest report from Congress is that in spite of all the pressure, the expansion of the metric system is not likely. All right, now Clause 6. The federal government is given authority over all counterfeiting, not only of money, but of securities and current coin, etc. Now that has been assigned, counterfeiting, do you get that? Counterfeiting has been assigned to the Secret Service and the Treasury Department to run down. Back in the 1800s, I'll tell you that was a real problem because in the early 1800s, money, the government wasn't putting out anything but coins. And so it was banks that were putting out notes. And they were very easy to duplicate. So now the government has taken our paper money and mixed in a lot of little multicolored silk threads and hired very fine engravers so that it's very easy to detect a job that is amateurish. So B is silk. And that brings us to Clause 7, which gave the government authority over post offices and post roads. I'll tell you now, that was going to be important. You know who our first postmaster was in the United States? Benjamin Franklin. That is under the British government. He was he did a lot to get communications going between the states and the cities. Well, the idea there was to ensure speed and security. That's why they wanted the federal government to take charge of the post offices, to ensure speed and security. Now let me ask you something. Can a private organization deliver the mail more economically and often much faster than the federal government? The answer is yes. But with equal security? The answer is no. That didn't work out that way. And so you'll notice that our post office department subcontracts the distribution of practically, or a great deal of our mail, except first class. The mail that may have checks in it or private contracts or something. First class mail is not subcontracted. All right, capital C. Now the authority to establish post roads has been exercised merely to designate which existing roads will be used for the transportation and delivery of the mails. It hasn't been used as a basis for the federal program of developing an international network of roads. They've used other purposes than that, like national defense, etc. All right, now Roman numeral 3. Congress was authorized in the Constitution to set up a national program to promote the arts and sciences. In what way? Not by federal grants to orchestras and artists like we're doing now, but for the purpose of granting copyrights and patents. Copyrights for books. People labor all their lives sometimes to write a really great book. Baron Charles de Montesquieu spent 20 years of his life writing his great book on the spirit of the laws. All right, the idea of copyrighting a book was to give the author protection for a period of time. Now, the founders didn't believe that when you had a good idea, it should be forever. And so the copyright law, which was originally just 28 years with a possible extension, has now been changed just recently, so that an author has a copyright throughout his own life, and his family or estate can get it for 50 years besides. So it's lifetime and 50. Lifetime plus 50 years. All right, now let's talk about a patent. So you got a wonderful invention. Now you want a patent. You can get a patent for 17 years. And you can construct it, build it, sublease it, whatever you want to do. It's yours for 17 years. It takes an act of Congress to extend it beyond that. But sometimes inventors get around it by just adding a little something fancy. Take the laser beam here. This is a marvelous invention. This is a marvelous invention. Laser beam will cut a diamond in two. You can shoot it to the moon and measure the distance within inches. That's become a great blessing. And it's going to be used in the television and recording industry very shortly to great advantage. All right, now if you do get a patent, must you reveal all the secrets connected with that patent? Is it necessary to reveal all the secrets? Yes, it is. Otherwise, it can't be protected. You've got to describe what you did that is supposed to be so unique. You've got to reveal the secrets. And is that why some inventors who have stumbled onto something rather simple that is phenomenal don't ever patent? Yes. So those last two blanks are yes, yes. Two yeses. All right. All right, now the federal government was authorized to set up courts from the Supreme Court on down to handle federal business throughout the country, and we'll discuss that under Article 3, so we don't need to discuss that much now. All right, now there's some things that states just can't do, and those ought to automatically be put in the federal government. I think you'll agree with that. And so here we have, in Clause 10, anything having to do with piracies or crimes on the high seas or international law should go to a federal court. I think we all appreciate that. All of these things are beyond the jurisdiction and the capacity of any one state to properly handle. Everybody follow that? I'll tell you, those days of piracy were something. It's hard to see this up on the screen now, but I tell you, they used to come in and they'd storm a ship and they'd loot it and then burn it and sink it, and many times the crew would be killed. Well, those were terrible days. And in the days of the Founding Fathers, piracy was very widespread. And so that was given the jurisdiction of the federal government, or to the federal government. All right, now clause number 11. The Congress, not the President, is given the responsibility of making all of the initial decisions concerning the waging of war. Not the President, but the Congress. Capital A, the Congress has the authority to declare war. Two of the biggest mistakes that has ever been made in our lifetime by the federal government was its failure to declare war in that terrible debacle in Korea and the second one in Vietnam. They were called police actions. In Korea, it took 3 million men circulated through the draft to keep 500,000 men fighting on that front, and it was called just a police action. And we had heavy casualties in both of those wars. And then the Vietnam War was the same. And Jane Fonda was able to go up among the communist troops and tell our men who were fighting on radio how stupid they were and how bad America was and how the communists were right. And you couldn't do a thing about it. Even though treason is giving aid and comfort to the enemy, there was no declared enemy, the courts have held, until it's been officially so declared by the Congress. All right, the Then capital B, the Congress can authorize the granting of letters of marque and reprisal. Did you ever hear that before? Oh, those were so important in the days of the Revolutionary War because we had no navy. So the government gives private owners of boats a letter of marque and reprisal. You can put a cannon up in the front of your boat and go out and attack the enemy like you were an American warship. Now, if you went out and attacked the enemy without one of those letters, what's the situation if they capture you? What are you? You're a pirate. What's the penalty for being a pirate? Yeah, you can be hanged. All right, so a letter of marque and reprisal is an authorization given to a private citizen allowing him to seize booty or make arrests as an official of the United States. And just recently, some of our fishing boats found all of their equipment underwater being destroyed by a Russian fleet, and they wanted letters of marque and reprisal so they could put guns out there and order the Russian ships away from the Newfoundland area where we have rights to fish and they don't. And the government decided not to give them letters of marque and reprisal. They just they sent out some of our own naval craft, and we just arrested all those Russian ships, brought them into Boston. One was fined $40,000, another $60,000, and another $80,000. But see, marque and reprisal, that's come up in the news just recently. All right, the Congress has the responsibility to establish rules also dealing with captures on land and sea, either in wartime or peacetime. Now, they didn't want a heavy peacetime army in the hands of the president. They wanted to be able to keep the size and control of the army under the civilian decision-making of the Congress. And so, no appropriation for the military arms of our nation is to be made for more than 2 years. It all has to come back for scrutiny. 2 years. And at the time of the Revolutionary War, as all of you know, we didn't have a navy, so we sent out John Paul Jones, and what a hero he was with his letters of marque and reprisal. He went right after them, went right to Britain, attacked their boats right in their own harbors. Well, so we've got to have authority to build a navy. And so that's your blank. And then it was provided that Congress would set up the rules for both the land and naval forces. Both the land and naval forces. Now the president, the Congress rather, not the president, has the authority to call up the militia of the states. The Congress can do that, not the president. He's in charge once they're called up, but he doesn't call them up. And at the beginning of our next session, I'm going to describe for you what a militia is. Many people belong to the militia and don't even know it. And that's where we'll begin the last half of Lesson 9.